Um, I will say I'm happy to be back in Indianapolis. I love B-Town, nothing wrong with it. Just happy to be back home. Thank you. Before we get started, I want to give a huge thank you to Indiana Humanities, Indiana Sciences, the Indiana Public Libraries, and all of the other partners who have helped make this possible, including Vonnegut Festival organizers who allowed us to participate and partner with them. Is there anything you would like to say about the festival? It does kick off tomorrow. Where can we find information on events?
This is the How are we? Okay, good. This is the first of 4 nights of Granfalooning. After tonight, we're heading back to Bloomington. The Granfaloon is an arts, culture, and ideas fest focused on Southern Indiana. The guiding spirit is, of course, Kurt Vonnegut. We originally had a few different names. We were going to call the fest Kurtchella or Vonnapalooza, but we settled on Granfaloon. Vonnegut is the presiding spirit. He had a very democratic approach to art. He believed no matter who you were, you should try to practice art, and we stick to that spirit down in Bloomington. We have readings, performances. We have a club fest on Friday night, and on Saturday, out on Kirkwood Avenue, we have a free concert featuring Japanese breakfast and car seat headrest. So you're all welcome to come down for a free show. It's going to be a great event. We have a giant Vonnegut puppet typing and smoking up and down Kirkwood Ave. It would be great to see you all there.
I did not know about that last part. That might be worth the trip down to Bloomington.
It sure is.
That might be. So if y'all have some free time this week, feel free to head down. But if not, and if all you do this week is participate in this discussion about Galapagos, I hope y'all read it. And I hope you were about as confused as I was in the first 150, 200 pages. And that is what we are going to talk about today. How rude of me. My name, for those of you fortunate enough to not know me, my name is Allison Essex. And I am joined by my 2 wonderful guests who will help guide us through we'll call it the journey that is this book. And from what I understand is pretty much all of Vonnegut's work. So could you 2, I know you just introduced the festival, but also introduce yourself.
I'm Ed Commentali. I'm a professor of English down at IU Bloomington. I'm also the director of the Arts and Humanities Council, which hosts the Granfalloon each year.
Very nice.
Good evening, everybody. I'm Jason Kelly. I am the chair of the history department at IUPUI, as well as a professor in the department. I have faculty positions in Africana Studies and American Studies, and I direct the IUPUI Arts and Humanities Institute. So I'm kind of like Ed here in Indianapolis.
The Ed of Indianapolis. Nice. So let's go ahead and get started talking about this book. It's talking about Galapagos. So maybe a question for you, Ed. For those of you, if you're like me, and this was your first Vonnegut work, and maybe this is a self-report telling y'all that this is my first work, but I gotta say, it seems like he has a very particular style. Is there something, what is it about his work? And is this book unique, or does it kind of fall in line with his vibe?
I think this book is typical Vonnegut for sure. It's a hell of a lot of fun. It seems kind of pointless at times, but then also very poignant at the same time. Vonnegut has this trick in a lot of his books where he'll tell you exactly what's going to happen in the first page or 2. There aren't a lot of plot secrets to be revealed, and it's not really about the plot. It's about this amazing, haphazard, really goofy and silly journey to get there, and following along on the route. I love that about Vonnegut, and I think that's very typical of his style. Something that I think is also typical and important to this book is Vonnegut has this wonderful mix of black humor and sentiment, of real like dark cynicism, as well as an incredibly humane vision and care for his characters. I'll read Vonnegut novel one year and it'll seem like a complete tragedy to me. And I'll read the next year and it's hilarious. It's the funniest thing I've ever read. And I don't know any other author who can really mix the tragic and the comic, the mocking and the sentimental. And I love that about this book. The last thing I'll just say that's typical is Vonnegut's one of the few writers that I know that allows you to exercise your own moral vision, your own moral judgment. There are no easy answers in this book or any of Vonnegut's books, but there's a lot of room for you to think along with him and to figure out what your own values are, what your own responses are to some really kind of catastrophic historical events. He's not preacherly. He wants to think alongside you, and he wants to open up room for you to think in his books. And that's just a rare gift in literature, and that's one of the reasons why I love all of his novels.
Absolutely. Now, was this read a funny read, or was it kind of a sad read?
This
year.
Humanoid seals farting on rocks. I mean, that's a pretty hilarious read, I would say. There's some great stuff. Everyone in this book is somewhat of a buffoon, but they're also lovable, really. Absolutely. And it's just a tender novel. I find it sweet from start to finish. And the journey of the narrator, Leon Trout, who really finally gets to tell his story at the end, is just kind of heartrending at times. So it is a sweet reading for me this time around.
Absolutely. Is there anything you'd like to add?
I mean, Ed really summed it up really well. I mean, I just love Vonnegut's use of satire. I love the structure of a typical Vonnegut novel where you get these little snippets, right? And they just kind of sit next to each other until they all come together at the end. But each of those little snippets has this bit of gold in it, right? So you can just sit down for it for 5 minutes and get that insight, and it's insight after insight, and like Ed said, it opens up a lot of ways for thinking. While I was reading it, I was reading it a couple of weeks ago, and it threw me back to Cat's Cradle, right? With this concern that Vonnegut has over and over again with environment, and what we are doing to the world around us, and that Cat's Cradle was one of his earliest pieces, and this is, in the mid-'80s or so. And this is an ongoing concern of Vonnegut. And I thought, you asked if it was tragic or comic. Of course, there's strong comedy to it, but given the context we're in, I was actually reading it as this tragedy. So, but maybe that's where I am right now.
No, I think I'm with you on the tragedy, although I we'll get to the seals later. That's all I'm going to say is that we're getting to the seals. So I'm glad you brought up the environment. Is there a significance to this this book centering around the Galapagos, like specifically? And I put that in the context of like the heavy emphasis on Darwin and Darwin's theories.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, simply put, of course, the Galapagos Islands were central to Darwin's theories that he developed from the 1830s through the rest of his life, actually. And of course, the prototypical example from the Galapagos Islands are those finches, right, which we read about in the book, and the niches that each of those finches lives in, right, as kind of the example of what natural selection looks like. I thought it was just kind of genius to use the Galapagos, right? Because the way it's framed, this is a place where these humans go where there isn't in general a lot of human contact. Not a lot of folks are traveling there. So it's kind of the perfect setting for all this to happen. And as the novel goes on over the course of the 1,000,000 years plus of the novel that we read, I found it really interesting. It's the only place where you could put humans so that they can evolve over the course of the 1,000,000 years, right? And what I thought was particularly interesting about the Galapagos, Darwin talks about the Galapagos as this place where these creatures inhabit these perfect niches. They've evolved to work within these niches. The only animal on these islands that's not suited for their environments are the humans that show up there, and so. He keeps reminding us over the course of that 1,000,000 years, they're the only ones that evolve. It's the humans are the ones who don't fit in to the balance of the planet. And so when I read about when I saw the Galapagos Islands, that's kind of what I took away from it. It's of course this reference, but of course it's the perfect kind of natural space for setting the novel in as well.
Do you know, are the Galapagos still, I guess, uninhabited? I don't know, maybe that's a dumb question.
I I know there are islands that are protected.
Okay.
Yeah,
For environmentally.
but I don't know the details of
Okay.
everything.
I'm just curious.
There's this really fun and interesting critique of big brains, of human brains as an evolutionary disaster, right? There's sort of an appendage that only gets us into trouble, like giant antlers, let's say. And I think that the book is like really doing an interesting job of criticizing like the logic of fitness, of like what we think is fitness, or what we think might be a superior species or race. I'm kind of fascinated by the ways in which like Darwinian logic has become like social Darwinian logic, and the way that different groups, different populations, different nations in the last 100 years have declared themselves as fitter, as better, and because of that, able to conquer other nations or able to destroy nature. And Vonnegut is kind of making a joke of the logic of fitness, really. I mean, everything, mostly what happens in the book is based on chance, on luck, haphazard, really. And the people who think they're the fittest are often the most blundering in the novel, the stupidest, really. Particularly the brothers who are in charge of the ship and the hotel, respectively. So I think that, a lot of, Vonnegut's looking at a 100-year history of Darwinian horror when it comes to World War I and World War II. And he's really kind of poking fun at the whole notion of fitness and trying to kind of challenge what we think might be superiority from a human perspective. Yeah.
And funny enough, and that makes me think of the fact that, the child born on the Galapagos with fur would not be seen as an advantageous trait. And then joke's on you, it absolutely is, and has defined what comes to be a million years later, the human race.
Yeah.
So yeah, the big brain, maybe not as useful at this point as furry babies. So this brings, and I think that's a great lead into our first turn and talk, which if this is your first time with Books, Booze, and Brains, and this is your first time with us, a turn and talk question is where you will turn and talk. Very simple. And the question, this book really introduces the idea of this big brain, this supposed evolutionary trait that has helped us, leave the caves and build, empires, is really to our detriment and is not so much an advantageous trait. And this got me thinking of other examples, human or not human, of traits or adaptations that maybe aren't advantageous, or maybe they just serve no purpose. Are there traits that would evolve or develop that maybe just aren't beneficial? Can we think of any beyond our big, stupid human brains? Are there other animals that have traits that you're like, maybe that's actually not good? Maybe they could do without that. And I feel like that's a fun question to think about. I think some examples that have come up in the past are like cats playing with mice. Is playing with a mouse, that's not helping you. We're talking in the wild. I'm not talking in my living room with the one that snuck in through the hole in my wall. So I'll give y'all, we'll say 10 minutes to turn and talk, and maybe you don't come up with anything, and maybe you go off on a tangent. That is fine. We are likely to do that up here. And if you're joining us on the live stream, we will indulge in these tangents. But for now, I'll give y'all 10 minutes to turn and talk about maybe not so advantageous selections. Oh, yeah. So I'll go ahead and repeat the question. Can you think of any examples or adaptations or traits that maybe are not so advantageous? Like, why would evolution pick that trait? Whether that be an animal trait, a human trait. We talked about communication styles. We've talked about physical traits, genetic traits. In any human or non-human, animal, bug, bacteria, viruses. Ooh, we're getting down the evolutionary tree.
Oh no, you got it. I think I have it here. Yeah. No.
I noticed like everything else.
No, that's okay. I knew we'd have a break. I could readjust it. Yeah. No, this is fine.
Okay.
Yeah. It's
Yeah,
tough.
when we're normally we're outdoors at Black Acre. That's our normal venue, and they shut down the whole place. It's just us. It's outdoors, and it's very secluded, so it's a nice venue. Um,
Yeah.
so this is a unique problem, but not advantageous.
Oh.
I was gonna say,
Well,
there are a lot of researchers who would argue. There's a lot of diabetics who would argue your pancreas is very useful and important.
You know, it's kind of interesting to think about. Are we live now? By the way.
Yeah. So sorry, I should have introduced this to
Okay.
y'all.
Yeah.
So we're gonna continue talking for those on the live stream.
Sure. Okay.
And then we can come back and we can share. If nobody wants to share, like we can talk about what we
Yeah.
talked about.
Well, yeah. Well, the question's interesting, right? I almost think that we need to. Maybe not everybody in the audience knows what natural selection, what Darwin's theory of natural selection is, and it might be
Yeah.
worthwhile revisiting that as a
Yeah.
group because
Maybe when we come back, that's what we can
yeah,
do.
because the environment in many ways determines what is a useful adaptation or not. So I guess I'm trying to avoid the answering your question here by moving it back in that direction. But you know, I mean, Darwin reminds us, right? Everything is random, right? Mutations are random from generation to generation. These mutations only have importance when you add selection pressure and time, right? And you know, I find it really interesting. And that moment that he's formulating this, right? He relies on so many different people. Like he relies on this 18th century recognition that there is evolution in species, right? His grandfather, Erasmus Darwin, right, was famous for his thoughts on evolution. And then you have Thomas Malthus, who's arguing for population pressures and the importance of almost pushing us towards competition, right? And then we have Charles Lyell, the geologist, who argues for deep time, right? So we're entering a moment when we can have million-plus year histories. So all of a sudden we're at that point in the 1840s, 1850s where all those pieces come together, and then Darwin's empirical observations. He just needs to pull all those together in order to make the argument. Even if he doesn't know the reason why it works from generation to generation, he's able to put the circumstances together.
Right. It's interesting with the logic of luck and chance. I mean, I think Vonnegut's really riding that part of the theory. For sure, to sort of take some of the hot wind out of it. Of the concept of fitness. The way that's been kind of misinterpreted. I'm wondering about the geological, like, temporal span of the book. I mean, do you find that fits in with like current thinking about geological time and the Anthropocene and all the work that you've been doing? Is this somehow a precursor to sort of the deep time thinking that a lot of scholars are doing now?
Yeah, you know, this might be something we talk about as a group too. 1985, the first thing I did was like, when was this written? I pulled this out, 1985, which is a really interesting moment because it's at this moment, 1986, I think, is when the first reports come out about like the ozone hole, and Earth system scientists are beginning to talk about humanity's transformation of our atmospheres, right? And I think I'm going to talk about this on Saturday at my talk, but 1988, 89 is when the Pixies' Doolittle album comes out, right?
Awesome. Yeah.
And you have Monkey Gone to Heaven, right? Which is this environmental song. And it's in part response, having grown up on the East Coast and my grandparents lived at the beach in New Jersey. I'd go to the New Jersey like all the time. In 1986, 87, there was all this medical waste showing up on the beaches of New Jersey. And this is sung about in the Pixies song, right?
Yeah.
They talk about this medical waste that's showing up. They talk about the ozone hole in the song, and they talk about how humanity is going to burn itself up. And like to your point, I think this is like a moment when we start this like second half of the 1980s is while we've talked about humans' effect on the globe, I think we're actually starting to see major concern about humans transforming the climate in a popular sense, right? We got the Vonnegut book here. We have the Pixies. That's just two examples, right? But we have this, I think, this deep time as part of it. But to your question about the million years, there's no way humans could evolve in a million years, right? Like
Right,
into seals.
Right.
So that's really interesting. It's almost short, deep time.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
That's right. That's hilarious. When was the first Earth Day? Do you know? Because it seems like it was about
Was it 70?
89, 90. Oh, I thought it was 89.
That was the 70s. That's good.
We need to look this up.
One of the guests in Bloomington said he knew exactly when it was, but I don't.
Okay.
Let's see here. This is the great thing about having phones. We can look this up. Earth Day. Wikipedia.
Yeah. Yeah, thank God for those big brains coming up with these phones.
1970.
70. Oh, I'm way
1970.
behind.
Wow.
So I
Wow.
think wasn't Earth Day in response to the oil spill in Santa Barbara, California, or was that? Sorry, I might be mixing
You're
Yeah.
up
asking the
my,
wrong millennial.
my stories.
History before
You're asking the
2005
wrong
doesn't
Gen
exist to
Xer,
me.
too.
Earth Day. Yeah, 69 Santa Barbara oil spill.
It's
Nice.
really, I mean, this earlier moment of environmentalism that the book kind of nods toward is Vietnam related, and it's West Coast environmentalism.
Yes.
And I really found it fascinating. There's a passage where Leon Trout is talking about the devastation that the bombs created in Vietnam.
Yeah.
And what it meant to return, after the war, and to recognize that we're living in a constant state of war against the environment.
Yeah.
And there's this fabulous moment, very dark moment in the book where the narrator is describing the bomber plane with its like a Japanese computer and its French engine, and and how all these nations have come together to create like engines of war, but it's engines of perpetual war, and the economy and this sort of mass violence are so intertwined in the book. And so, what you're watching here is like an entire like global civilization, at war with the planet, really. And it's kind of neat to see Vonnegut pivot from what are essentially his like war novels, I think, his early career, thinking about World War II in particular and sort of circling around that issue over and over again into thinking about the environment and the war on the planet. It's a really kind of fascinating career shift in focus to watch.
And the role, and as you say, the role that globalization plays in this, right? Because it's driving economies, but it's driving these asymmetrical economies, right?
Yeah.
When everything collapses, it's not the Western former imperial, or I shouldn't even say former imperial powers, but imperial powers that are the ones that have collapsing currencies, right? It's all around the globe. So he's connecting war finance,
technological
development, and environmentalism all together. I mean, this really is like Anthropocenic thinking, right?
Yes,
that's exactly what this is, to see the human systems and the Earth systems kind of intertwined with each other.
Right. Yeah. Should we ask are we done with our 10 minutes, you think? Or
I think we're about there. Yeah, if we could go ahead
that's great.
and switch back to live. A little early, but I think we have some points that we should probably talk about as a group.
Good.
But I think that's part of what gets me is that it's fiction. But I mean, I cannot tell you how many times I had to just put it down because it was like, oh, this got too real, too fast. And yeah.
Right.
It's like looking in an ugly mirror.
It sure is.
Yeah. All right. Let's come back from our turning and talking. If that was your first one, I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you went off on a tangent and a couple I know we did for our live streamers. But one of the things that we talked about, and I'll go ahead and introduce this before I'll let y'all, unless y'all came up with something good. If y'all could think of something immediately that was an adaptation that maybe was not so advantageous. But one of the things we talked about was like the real definition of survival of the fittest. Like we're talking about survival of the fittest, but what does that really mean? Because I think colloquially we use that term quite a bit, but maybe it doesn't mean what we actually think it means. And I think that's something that you were talking about.
Yeah. So what I was bringing up in our conversation is maybe it's as we're talking about adaptation and mutations, we talk about what natural selection is as it was described by Darwin, right? He never used the term survival of the fittest. That was popularized later by Huxley. What Darwin is talking about when he's talking about natural selection is he's talking about a few things happening together that he's observing. So he's seeing, and scientists of his day, and frankly, generations previous to Darwin, are seeing species change over time. There's a common understanding that species change over time by the time Darwin is writing about this. He's seeing these, he's learning from people like Thomas Malthus that populations of, in Malthus's case, he's talking about humans, are putting pressure on their environments, right? And there's population competition to some extent. And Darwin is bringing that in. He's also bringing in this idea of deep time, which was current in Darwin's day as well. A famous geologist, Charles Lyell, argued that the Earth was a lot older than the 6,000 years that a lot of contemporaries believed it was. And when Darwin starts pulling all these things together with his empirical observations, he's able to make the case for natural selection, which is environmental pressures, being what they are, will give an advantage to some mutations. Mutations are completely random, they can't be predicted, but some mutations might allow a species to better exploit the food, perhaps, in their environment, and then be able to pass that genetic code on to, of course, Darwin didn't know about genes, we know about these, but they can pass on these traits to the next generation. And that's effectively what natural selection is. So the idea is that these mutations might have an effect or they might not have an effect. It all depends on how well adapted they are to the environment in which the species or animal lives.
Is there anything you'd like to add?
Let's ask them what what we think our adaptations are that don't do us any good anymore.
Us or anything else, other animals, bacteria, viruses. Yeah, go ahead. Tails. Very nice. So tails, just all tails, all animal tails, some animal tails. No, just in general. That's fair. I don't know. Are tails useful? Maybe for balance for some animals, swimming.
For the squirrels in my backyard.
Okay, that. For the squirrels, yeah. Is cuteness an adaptation? Maybe that's something.
Sure.
If it's cute, if the tail makes it cute enough, the humans will make sure it lives. And maybe that's the adaptation.
There are studies on cuteness that show it's a survival technique for
All right.
between
You heard
generations.
it here
Yes.
you heard it here, folks.
Not a scientist, but I know about cuteness.
Maybe that's something next time you go to the zoo.
Chris behind you has a
Oh yeah.
example.
This is probably not a completely physical attribute, but it has to do with the big brains. I'm the curator of the Monument Museum, and I've read this book far too many times, which is interesting because it's really not one of my favorites, but there are some really interesting ideas in it. And one of the interesting ideas was the big brain. Many years ago, when someone was giving me a hard time about the inability to multitask, I Googled multitasking, and I realized that there's a fair amount of thought process out there that says that either doesn't exist at all or it's something that's very rare. Like some people can go from task to task very quickly, but they're an extreme minority. And then most people are just giving themselves an anxiety attack and like harming themselves needlessly. So I just thought that was really interesting. That was one of those things where if we could slow society down, turn our brains off, get real rest, I think that would be a nice devolution from where we're at right now.
Two things that make me laugh in this book, Chris, is one is all the ways in which people try to turn off their brains or kill their own brains because they're such a burden. Definitely through alcohol. There you go. Cheers to you too, Chris.
Cheers to Upland.
That's one thing that strikes me as interesting to talk about today. The other is that if we get rid of big brains, how many cultural products that we love do we also get rid of? Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, the Japanese art of flower arrangement. There are a number of things in the novel that we have to throw out with our big brains. And Vonnegut is like really playing with us here. And I think what's special about this book is he's asking you again and again, what would you keep, right? Which parts of human culture would you keep and put in your time capsule, let's say? Again and again, you know, he's sort of raising this question. And I find it interesting to think, you know, do we really need all of this cultural material that's around us? What purpose does it serve, really? And I think that's the heart of the book that he's asking us over and over again, you know, as we're reading. Pets are another one that he's kind of interested in. Yeah, right, exactly. What's worth keeping? What have we created that we want to continue with? Yes. Mm-hmm. That's wonderful. Yeah.
No, but that same brain that allows us to enjoy pleasure and enjoy the culture and enjoy that, like that's also, and that's something that we were talking about in our discussion with the live stream. That same brain that makes all these beautiful, wonderful things and allows us to experience pleasure like in that way is also what has created this war machine, that has created this environmental destruction, and that tortures us, and ultimately, as the book leads us to at the end, is our demise. is the and we're watching it happen live.
One of the key things that we might not need is a Vonnegut novel, right? I mean, which is
so heartbreaking.
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of Leon Trout as the narrator he's a ghost, right? He can really not change the world at all. He's writing a book that no one could read because there are only SEAL people around. They don't have hands to hold a book. And one of the jokes of this novel is about Vonnegut's own reputation as a writer and his own impact on the world. Can an author change things? What's the role of the author? What's the role of an author's brain? Leon Trout witnesses 1 million years of history, but for what reason? Like, what's the point of someone jotting down historical disasters? I think Vonnegut's really questioning his own role in our culture, not just what he's participated in, World War II, Vietnam, whatever it might be, but also as a writer and whether he serves any real purpose in the current day and age. And there's a kind of moment we have to ask, I mean, the big brains that created napalm, the big brains that have destroyed the planet, are also the big brains that write novels about that destruction. And this is a real, like, intense self-interrogation, I think, that Vonnegut is going through here.
He points out that people can be very contradictory at times. Like, and I think he hit the nail on the head. I immediately thought of Jerry Garcia. I'm a fanatical bedhead. There's nothing I would do to it. I would never want to live in the world for even 5 minutes without the Grateful Dead. But I look at a guy who was married 5 times and died of sleep apnea at 54 while looking 87. I mean, it was just, you know, that came at a cost to Jerry Garcia.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that was great. Oh. Yeah, and I would love for you in our conversation. We brought up there's an air of historical context to even when this book was published, and the I mean, I hope you all agree with me. Very relevant and pertinent now, and it was very much. I could have read a newspaper last week, and it could have been what this book was talking about, but it's not. This book was published in the mid 1980s, and there's context for this.
Go ahead.
Yeah, sure.
The historian.
So 1985. When I pick up a book, I almost always look at the copyright date to see when this was written, and I noticed this one was written in 1985, and it meant more to me as I was reading through it. Like I got to the first half through it, and I thought, well, why was Vonnegut writing this in 1985? I would make the argument that there's a shift taking place in the mid 1980s. And it's the popularization of the idea, not that humans have an impact on the planet. That Earth Day had been going since 1970, right? We know humans have an impact on the planet. But humans have an impact on the planet so much that we create ozone holes, right? These are reports that are coming out in the mid 1980s, mid to late 1980s. We have people responding to this through popular culture. I mentioned one of my favorite albums. If Chris is going to talk about the Grateful Dead, I'm going to talk about the Pixies. Doolittle, which is an album that came out in the late 1980s, which some of you hopefully have heard. There's a song on there called Monkey Gone to Heaven. The singer talks about medical waste that's washing up on the beaches on the East Coast. He's talking about climate change and the heating up of the planet, talking about the ozone hole. And I think there's a case to be made that what Vonnegut's picking up on here is a cultural shift that's happening. That not only are we changing the environment, but we're changing the planetary system. And that's engaging with science that's happening at this moment. And I think Vonnegut's right there in the middle of it. So that's kind of the context. And then, Ed, I'll pass this over to you, the context of globalization and warfare and these types of things.
Yeah, what I think is interesting about this moment in Vonnegut's career is that Vonnegut has made a name for himself as an author of World War II, in particular, the firebombing of Dresden. And that is a kind of interesting, isolated incident in his biography. But in this novel, the world exists in a constant state of warfare, right? It is continuous war. And it's not only continuous war between nations, but continuous war is, in his mind, against the planet. There's this wonderful passage where they're talking about the Peruvian fighter bomber who is flying over Ecuador, and he's about to release his bomb. And what's intriguing about that is that the different parts of that plane come from different countries. There's a computer in it from Japan, the plane comes from France, there's a bomb from, I forget what the other country is, but this like multinational conglomeration came together to create this, basically a technological weapon of destruction. And Vonnegut is like trying to understand like this change in the world. We don't have Axis and allies anymore, right? We don't have good guys and bad guys. We have a constant global war that is engaged with technological development, corporate development, as well as an attack on the environment at all times. And I find it really interesting that Vonnegut, who's so successful as a World War II writer and so notable as that, is affecting this transition to thinking about global catastrophe. It's an important shift for him, and I think it's an interesting like artistic break for him to move into this new mode of an environmental writer in some way. That passage is terrifying to me because I do feel like this is the constant war that we still exist in. But it's funny, my daughter's at college now, and whenever there's a new war announced, her response is, "We're always at war." Since I've been alive, we've been at constant warfare. And she means both wars between nations, but wars against the planet. And this is something that's happening, and I think there's a real shift, and a lot of scholars think in the 1980s and 1990s, there's this like sort of neoliberal shift towards global warfare in this way. And I think the book is very valuable for kind of tracking that moment, giving us a sense of that moment as Vonnegut sees it. We could disagree about this, but he's theorizing this new version of global catastrophe that I think a lot of young people and continue to really adopt and believe in, for sure.
Oh,
Yeah.
for sure. Which is why I mentioned that I'm a millennial, and me reading this now, I'm like, oh yeah, I relate to this every day of my living existence.
Yeah.
And so for this to have been written in the mid 1980s and 1986, and be as relevant then as it is today, is almost, it's sad, but maybe would disappoint Vonnegut a little bit that we read works like his and others, and we just continue.
Well,
You look the other way, you ignore it. It's like looking in a mirror and just saying, oh.
well, his first novel, Player Piano, signaled Vonnegut's real fear and criticism of technology as it replaces human character, human identity, human usefulness. His novels again and again have characters, human characters, who want to be useful, who even at times they say, I just want to be used in some way. And it's a weird statement, but there's a kind of loss of dignity, I think, that Vonnegut is theorizing here. There's like a loss of human dignity when people can be replaced by machines. The most, obviously the most fun and innovative invention of this is Manderax, which is basically an iPhone, like a 1985 iPhone. It does everything. It even has a camera in the corner. I mean, this is a textbook for inventing an iPhone. And the man's wife, the man who invented this, his wife hates this device because it shows so little regard for her as a human being. It's so insulting to her. And this kind of like intense feelings of like, we need technology and we hate our technology is like totally wrapped up in this book. I mean, apart from anything on the environment, this is all about this like digital age, I think, and the massive amounts of technology that surround us and the massive amounts of information that surround us that we don't know how to process or value or understand in any way. And it just feels like an assault on human dignity to Vonnegut. Anyway, I'm ranting now.
I really love
go. This is the place.
I really love that, Ed. And to bring us back to Darwin, to bring us back to the early mid-19th century, right? These are conversations folks are having in the mid-19th century. When Ed was talking about Vonnegut, I'm hearing John Ruskin. I'm hearing John Ruskin arguing about the horrors of the mechanical age and just humans reproducing things by rote, turning humans into unthinking machines to reproduce goods as commodities, mass commodities, and arguing that human value is to some extent picked up by William Morris. Human value is embodied through work, through doing, through creating, through having the capacity to think about what you're doing, to change what you're doing, and not mechanically reproduce. So these are conversations these are industrial revolution conversations, in part repackaged for the technological age that's emerging in the 1980s. So I found that a really interesting thing. We're going back to Darwin, but we're also going back to Ruskin and Morris.
Yes. There's a moment where Leon Trout he's confronted by his father. And it's one of my favorite moments in the book. And his father is like, you got to come down the blue tunnel. It's time for you to go. You've had enough time on Earth, 1,000,000 years, and if you don't leave now, I'm not coming back. And Leon has this like curiosity, he says, like, I want to stay here. I want to know more about these people. And his dad just says, you don't know you don't understand anything. You just have information. Like you've just gathered more and more information, but there's no understanding there. And I read that as like a real like digital problem, like that like Manderax and Leon are just recording constantly, but it doesn't change anything. Like it doesn't create anything. And there's something about in this book between like having information and understanding the world. Those are like two very different things for Vonnegut. My other favorite moment about this is when he talks about soul, and he says soul is that part of you that knows that your brain is thinking something wrong, and he's really trying to figure out like where is the human at this moment of like mass information and mass technology. Where can we like locate something that we can call human that isn't simply technology or isn't simply archive or digital machine? And that's something that's like kind of floating around at the edges of this book, But I think he's doing like a serious investigation of what the human is at this moment and what can we do to preserve it in some way. Sorry.
Well, and if it's worth preserving at all. I mean,
Yes.
I mean, by the end of it, your seal's farting,
Yes.
laughing at farts on rocks. You know, is that the human that we've preserved over a million years?
Right, right.
Because if that's it, I mean, there's a classroom of 12-year-olds that would agree with you.
There are machines and animals, but there's no human in between. And I think that's something that is getting lost at this moment in his understanding. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm glad you brought us back to Darwin and to the idea of evolution. One of the things that we had talked about in our in one of our many tangents, which we're not done yet, we talked about like a realistic timeline for evolution and like human evolution in particular. And this is something that we had even talked about in Bloomington. I think there's two parts. One, it seems like technology and our big brains and our development, modern medicine, I could list off a million things, have caused us to kind of skirt evolution. Mutations, I mean, I'm in health and disease research. Variants and mutations that cause human disease, we're able with modern medicine and with advanced therapeutics, we're able to extend human lifespan and we're able to carry on these traits that maybe in a non-industrialized, non-modern world, that person would not have survived or that person would not have lived to reproduce. And so what is a realistic evolutionary timeline for humans? And have we been just avoiding it with technology and with our big brains? Maybe?
Ed's looking at me.
Okay.
Well, it's interesting that Vonnegut gives us 1 million years to turn into seals, right? But it gets jump-started by our technology, right? It gets jump-started by nuclear bombs. So in some ways, he's getting around the issue of how long it would take to turn into seals. It took, 2 million years for Homo sapiens to develop, right? So it takes a long time for something that kind of looks like us to become us. So it would be very surprising to see evolution happen that fast for humans. So that's, I guess, the short answer to it. Yeah, I'll stop there.
Oh, yeah. I mean,
well, when I was thinking of evolution, so we received some of these questions ahead of time. So I was thinking about this morning. I was drinking my morning coffee, and I was thinking about evolution more generally, because I don't think you said human evolution. I think you said evolution.
Oh, okay.
So my brain started spinning.
So different timelines for
different timelines, because
okay.
populations happen at different rates, of course, depending on your species. And I was thinking specifically of a type of evolution that's really closely related to this, and that is the evolution of the COVID-19 viruses, right? That is, one might make the argument, I have made the argument on multiple occasions, that COVID-19 is what we might call an Anthropocene virus. I'll define the Anthropocene later, but the idea is that COVID-19, while it may exist, doesn't become a global pandemic without human culture. It requires deforestation. It requires urbanization. It requires large centers of population. It requires mass transportation. It requires global health systems that respond in particular ways to help drive the virus across the globe,
particular way.
And this allows the virus to then evolve, right? We've had multiple evolutions of this virus over the last few years. So what we're looking at is not just a pandemic that's a biological pandemic. We're looking at a culturally, technologically driven evolution as well. And so this will get to a question that we'll talk about in a little bit, but the relationship of nature and culture being intertwined with each other. We see this in Vonnegut, but we're also living through it even as we're talking about Vonnegut as well.
Which is terrifying. But thank you for pointing it out. Do you have anything you'd like to add?
No.
It was.
I'm speechless. I don't know what to say to that.
In a terrifying way.
Yes, I'm terrified right now.
Yeah, that's terrible to think about, that we're actively living through. So So yeah, I guess we have lived through multiple mutation events, and I guess that is we're watching it happen live. But you're saying humans would be on a much longer timeline.
Well, I don't know. I
Maybe.
mean, this is the thing about mutation, right? Like,
fair.
everything is random, everything is unpredictable.
Yeah.
One doesn't know where things move from here. So there isn't really a teleology or direction that evolution takes.
Okay, so he maybe was off on the million years for us to become seals.
Maybe. Yeah.
But I don't know. Maybe you're right. I didn't think about the nuclear impacts on the genetics. Maybe that's the jump start we need to get to the million. Great to think about. Great Tuesday night dinner conversation.
Sorry.
No, you ain't got nothing to apologize for. But I do think that leads us into our next turn and talk really nicely. Because this book goes in, going back to the big brains, they are capable of wonderful things. But as the book very frequently likes to remind us, it is responsible for all the terrible things that we experience and that we do and participate in, whether or not we're the ones participating or it's the guy in New York that's selling, a conservation cruise ticket when there is nothing environmentally friendly about taking a cruise to an ecologically niche environment. But these brains are, as much evil as they're capable of, also capable of good and wonderful things that we experience every day. And so you kind of hinted at it. There seems to be like what I would call a nature versus nurture. Your genetics explain part of it, right? Our genetics set up our brains, right? Our genetics set up our bodies and all that. And to an extent, it set up circuits that are required for normal functioning. But, post-birth, there is an environmental factor, right? There are strong environmental factors to things like behaviors, non-genetic adaptations, potentially. And I'm thinking specifically behaviors, like we're talking like good behaviors versus bad behaviors, whatever that may be. And so it seems like something that's maybe either not ignored. I don't want to call it ignored because I don't think Vonnegut necessarily ignores the contribution of environment to things like human behavior. But it seems like there's a nature versus nurture, like there's an environmental factor component to our big dumb brains that maybe we should be considering, whether that be the people you surround yourself with or the education you receive or whatever. There's definitely environmental contributions to those behaviors that we are spending this entire book blaming ourselves for. There's societal, there's cultural, factors, and I think we're going to talk about the cultural, the intersection of culture and biology. But for the turn and talk, I want you to think about in the vignettes that he shares, all of the characters that the book goes through. Is there an environmental contribution to the way they behave, to the way that they contribute to the 1 million year in the future human race? It's not how much of that is genetic, really? How much of that is their environment? And I think specifically the story that's most fleshed out is James Waite's story and how his upbringing strongly influenced and the things he experienced in his childhood and in his development strongly contributed to his behaviors leading up to him being on the boat, leading up to him dying in a freezer. And if you haven't gotten that far in the book, I apologize for spoiling that. So for your turn and talk about the nature versus nurture component. And if that's maybe ignored a little bit, if it's not ignored, and if nature versus nurture is a new idea for you, think of environmental factors that shape your behavior. Think of what surrounds you that shapes your behavior versus what's in your genetics. So I'll give you all 10 minutes.
Has anyone had any? I already had one. Would you like some?
You came prepared.
I came prepared.
Yes, you're hydrated. You're hydrated for that. That's the thing about James Waite. He is doing a kind of environmental, like
Sorry, did you say Ruskin?
James Waite is
James
doing like
Waite,
this
oh.
environmental,
Yep.
like building sort of novel, right? I mean, there's sort of like these childhood factors that make you who you are
Mm-hmm.
in a way, but then they don't always amount to anything, really. I mean, he gestures towards these like the sort of buildings roman over and over again. It's like this novel of like development, really, like how your environment shapes you.
Yeah.
But it doesn't go very far always with him, you know.
It's like when we're talking about like evolution, we're talking about the brain is not as great as we think. The brain is so complex, and to boil it all down to your genetics, the variation is so vast, and that variation is very strongly related to your environment and your what you're surrounded with and your upbringing and that input. I mean, I can't. And I mean, I think when we were in Bloomington, I was like the only person in the room that was very happy and just forego I was ready, but everyone else had things that they wouldn't want to lose, like culture, like communication.
Yeah. Right.
But it's the same brain that's doing all this good, that's recognizing it, that's writing about it, but also the same brain is totally fine with bombing third world countries and bombing innocent civilians and slaughtering people and killing the environment off. So like I feel like I cannot ignore the fact that like there's an environmental input, there's a cultural input, there's something else it's not like the book likes to joke it's the brain, but like is it really? Can we blame the brain for existing, for doing all these terrible things?
One theme that comes up again and again is full bellies versus empty bellies. And, the Von Cleese brothers have full bellies. And they never had anything. They never needed anything. Everything was taken care of for them. And he sort of is playing with that notion that because everything was taken care of for them, nothing matters. The future doesn't matter. Nothing matters. And then when he gets to the Cancobonos, they have empty bellies, and there's a different kind of like survivalist mentality around that. Mm-hmm. And I think there's something about material wealth and how poorly it prepares you.
Yeah.
Versus impoverishment, and I think a sort of a lack of material goods. There's a kind of binary there at work in the book. Would you agree with that? Or?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. Although there's this fear of calling it. I feel like there's a fear to some extent of calling it out in any like. It feels like he calls out a lot of things pretty directly, but this is one of those that kind of, I don't know, just never quite gets there, right?
Yes. Yeah.
And that might be a product of being in the mid '80s, right? I mean, this is the middle of the Cold War. I'm serious. Like, I think this might be one of the things that might be holding him back. Whereas if he wrote that today, it might be more directly addressed in a certain way.
Right.
Yeah, no, I think that's true.
There's something about like the progression of the story is all about like stripping away of material goods and amenities, and ultimately stripping away of appendages. And there's a way in which humans become like lean and mean survival fishermen, and that's where they're headed, really.
Yeah.
In his mind, that's a gain. In his mind is even the ships are stripped away, the nations are stripped away, like everything is kind of stripped away in this book.
Yeah.
Until you're just a kind of a spine with a jaw.
Yeah.
Which maybe is why it's not so directly addressed, because he's purposefully like, let's take away everything and just humans existing on their own, I'm on the same wavelength. I don't know how to put that in words.
Yeah.
And there's another interesting piece about this. So thinking about the brain can lead us down a particular path, right? It's very kind of individualist, right? Yes. That person's brain, that person's brain, that person's brain. And that's very much how Vonnegut approaches the brain. But the decisions that are being made are emergent, right? These are cultural decisions. Culture doesn't exist in any one person's brain, but a culture is a network. of symbols and shared practices, etc. And so what I think is a kind of an interesting thing here to think about is, despite evolution of this big brain must function within the social network, within a cultural network. And so there are emergent properties to all of those things coming together as well. Which is, I mean, that's tough to throw into a novel focused on evolution, but
so much.
it's so important, I think, when we do talk about evolution, because when we end up at the end, right, that network is stripped away, right? These are effectively seals on a beach.
Mm-hmm. I'm wondering about I think that's exactly right. I'm wondering about the sort of family as a cultural construction here, and family as something that the characters begin like very like really committed to, but you see all of these other configurations of family as we go on. And I'm thinking, I think that might be like a test case here about this idea of like cultural influence in the brain, you know, because like family in Vonnegut is like really malleable, and you have, you know, women with other women, you have the Kankobono, which is like a group of 6, you know, there are dogs in families, like it's a sort of incredible, it gets incredibly amorphous the way that these families like kind of line up. And I think that he's trying to sort of think beyond like heterosexual reproductive units and like move into these other kinds of, you know, modes. One thing that is always like striking.
What are you guys doing over there? We're sitting way over there and loving what's happening.
Oh, we're giving a presentation on Vonnegut's book right behind you there, Galapagos.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we're a book club that meets once a month. We're off in the summer, but we start back up in August. And typically we do like a science-themed, science-slanted book, and we'll bring in like an expert or experts in that like field. They are my wonderful experts, yes. I let them talk and show off how smart they are.
So what are you the experts at?
So
Everything and nothing.
in the theme of Vonnegut, everything and nothing.
So my daughter has this exact same shoes.
Love that. Crocs.
Teenagers, so good for you.
You know what? Doing what we can.
So
Yeah.
you are just answering questions.
We're professors. We're arts and humanities professors. We both run centers for arts and humanities.
Okay.
I do in Bloomington, and Jason does at IUPUI here in Indy. And he's a historian. I'm a literature professor. You can hear us all the way over there?
No, I can't. I'm sitting over there right underneath the garage door, and I'm like, what are they doing? So usually it's karaoke or something lame, and I'm like, no, they are talking about something, and I've got to figure it out.
Oh, we can switch to karaoke.
No.
That look says no. Okay.
We did not sign up for that.
My guess is the upcoming schedule.
Oh, yeah. So we don't have ours. Yeah.
Megan would have that.
Yeah. And grab a bookmark. We'll be doing, like I said, we'll start back up in August. And we haven't released our book list yet, but we meet, I don't know where we're going to meet, but yeah. Oh my God, no.
So like, it's like Tuesday.
Ah!
What is happening?
Yeah.
What is over here?
You're like, is this every Tuesday? Are we doing this? I wish. Yeah. Oh my God. No, thank you.
You too.
If you're on our live stream right now, we're recruiting people in person. Here, we'll come back in just
All
a
right.
minute.
Just a minute.
Yeah.
Okay.
When Rufus gets back.
Do we know how many people are streaming?
No, it's usually after the fact. People will watch.
Okay. So it's being
Yeah,
recorded.
we usually get a handful of live viewers. Not too many. So I always turn on stream on Twitch because I'm millennial trash.
That's great.
Yeah. 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 So if you're coming in 3 weeks later and you're like, what in Sam hell is going on? You're watching this in like July. You're like, what were they doing? We are just recruiting fans. We are recruiting future readers. And maybe we'll have to do another.
How's the volume
book.
back there? Is it any better or
Better?
still?
Good.
Okay. Okay,
Yeah.
cool. Thanks. Sam.
Maybe they just got really interested. They were like, oh, things. You guys are just so smart and engaging that people are like, I have to listen.
Something like that.
You're like
Yeah.
3 beers in, and they're just like, I have to know what they're
That's
talking
what it takes,
about.
3 beers in.
It's my favorite question, though. What are you experts of?
What- That's why it's so easy for me, because I'm like, oh, bone muscle,
Right,
like science,
right.
whatever. It's very
It's funny.
easy.
I'm
It's like,
trained in
whatever.
literature, but I'll talk more confidently about science than I will.
Oh, yeah? Then maybe I should have kept some of the biology questions. Maybe we should
I'm just making stuff up.
I mean, isn't that like 80% of genetics?
It seems like.
It's a histone. It's a transcription factor.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it would just it's not well studied. That's what I tell everybody. I'm like, great question. You know what? I'm not sure, but I
Yeah.
bet it has been studied before.
Right.
That is how I pass my defense.
Yeah,
yeah,
let's
we
go.
can come back.
Right.
Yeah, okay, we can come back. So this intersection, coming back from our turn in talks, I mean, we went off on a small tangent, but I think it was a good tangent. I thought it was an insightful tangent. This like environmental input to our brain, making it maybe less terrible. Because I came into, I think a few days ago, I really came into this like, the brain is terrible. I was ready to lose it. I don't know if anyone else was ready to become the SEAL person and ditch the brain. I was the only person brave enough to say, yeah, I'm ready to start farting on rocks and lay by a beach, because that sounds pretty good. And it sounded good back in January, sounds good now. But there, and we talked about this obviously in our turn and talk with our live stream. The book maybe hints at it, but is not as direct with the environmental impact and like the surrounding, like this cultural contribution to behavior, and what makes the brain so bad. But I mean, also, let's be fair, the brain is extremely complex, and I wish Jill were here because she's an actual neuroscientist. I am just a bone person, putting up a puppet of a neuroscientist trying to like understand how complex and insane the brain is. But we even were talking about like family structures and like how that plays into, how that's toyed with in this book. I mean, that I hadn't even thought of that.
Well, it's interesting how the book starts out with married couples, like paired off couples, male and female for sure. And this is not a happy thing in the book at all. There's this great line, I was just trying to look for it, where he talks about being in a marriage and communicating to your spouse is like being on roller skates and trying to talk to someone and just sort of going in every just different direction. Marriage is like a scam, like in this book. It's a con, it seems to me. And what I'm trying to figure out is like why the characters in this book, they evolve by like matching up in different ways. You get Akiko and Hisako, you get the Kankobono girls, you get the captain and Mary Hepburn. And in Vonnegut's novels, in his life, family is like a really malleable concept. He was divorced and remarried. He adopted his sister's children. His family was constantly evolving in these different ways. And I think that this book is like reaching for like something beyond the kind of typical or traditional family unit into something that's much more amorphous, much more open-ended, I think. And what's underpinning that change, I think, is like a loss of like reproduction, really. Like what happens in this book is that there are bacteria that are destroying the ability to reproduce. And so reproduction can't happen anymore. And with that, this kind of family is falling apart. But I don't think that he's necessarily seeing that as a bad thing, given all the calamitous families that are in this book. He's like reaching towards a more flexible notion of what a family could be. I think it's a really interestingly progressive aspect of his life and his writing as well. There's this line whenever I teach this book about Mary Hepburn, she can't have any children. And the line is something like, she's basically useless from an evolutionary perspective, right? And you can get really up in arms about that line. Like it's a horrific thing to say. But it also, in a way, it's weirdly, in the logic of the novel, freeing her from this family structure and the demands of reproduction. And what's intriguing is that she does actually engage in reproductive acts on the island, but just not like heteronormative ones. Like she's basically Mother Nature. She creates this new population, but she doesn't do it within the confines of a traditional monogamous marriage. And Mary Hepburn is just such I love Mary Hepburn. First of all, she's like an amazing teacher. She's like such a good teacher with her students. She's funny. She gets them interested. I think he really likes Mary Hepburn in a way. And it's just weird how she gets some kind of agency in this novel at the end of the world. She's like able to kind of chart this course to old age where she's, really honored on the island as opposed to the captain. So just going back to this idea of like culture and how it shapes you, Mary Hepburn is this like really weird outlier who's able to kind of navigate this identity that is not culturally circumscribed, it seems to me. And she starts off basically contemplating suicide, but she winds up making it in this really interesting way. I find it one of his better representations of a kind of woman from the second half of the 20th century. But anyway.
Yeah, I didn't know if you had anything you
Oh,
wanted
no,
to add. No. You're like, no.
Great summation. Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's why I brought up this question, because I feel like there are many examples of this, like, yes, the brain genetically, I mean, we're like, what, 99.99% similar, but that variation is your environment. And like part of the evolution, the million years in the future, part of the evolution is the culture and is things like the family unit and like what we are obliged to, like as people, as humans, is very different. And like, in a way, like the brain is still there, right? Maybe not as advanced, but the brain is still there. It's just all of that extra that arguably is, Vonnegut is blaming for all these terrible things. It's the difference is the surroundings and the environment and the input, which is why it got me thinking about that. I didn't know if anyone else wanted to share some of the things they talked about, or if you, since we are coming to the end of our wonderful discussion, if you have anything you would like to ask our experts, happy to indulge either discussion. And it can be about Vonnegut, it can be about the book, a detail, a person, a place, a thing, a noun.
Generation trauma can be passed down multiple generations, and that trauma affected in childhood affects genetics. And so thinking about how, psychologists and theorists at the time when, major neurochemicals started being discussed in the dialogue really didn't have that information, and how we know now that there isn't, a direct relation between nature versus that is something that's much more nuanced. And it's not even just prenatal, but
Yeah, on a genetic, molecular, epigenetic level, absolutely.
And one of the interesting things, if I can just jump in here and talk about this a little bit. I mean, you're right. What's really interesting happening at this moment, right, is sociobiology is out there in the world, like late 70s or so, and there's actually major debates taking place in scientific circles about these types of things. Stephen Jay Gould, is going head to head with E.O. Wilson, for example, in the late 1970s. Marshall Solins, an anthropologist, is getting involved in these conversations. What's kind of interesting about, and this might talk to Ed's point a little bit as well, this entanglement that you're referring to between biology and our environments also leaves out yet another really important thing, which is culture. Culture doesn't live in our brain. Culture is practiced between individuals, right? So we're talking about culture being this social networked thing of practices and symbols of people coming together, right? And this what we see in the novel are the emergent properties of this culture coming together. Vonnegut's blaming the big brains, but as I see it, he's blaming what's actually happening are the big brains are coming together with each other. And so the dissolution of this this heteronormative family unit that Ed talks about, is, I think, part of other dissolutions of culture that take place over those million years that, depending on how you look at it, are beneficial to the seals or the seal people at the end of the novel. But yeah, I think that is super, super important to recognize that nature, nurture, I mean, this isn't even a conversation in academia, right? So we've moved well past this. But of course, in the popular consciousness, this is still a way of thinking about the world of nature versus nurture.
Anything you'd like to add? No?
I'd like to hear more.
Yeah.
Folks.
Any other questions?
So I was thinking about the historical context, and I know you talked about this in terms of environment and thinking around the environment. Another, what's going on with the Cold War and whether and how you think that's influencing our current age.
All right, well, I'm gonna have to go back like 3 years to the last time I lectured on this and try to remember my notes. Well, 85, right? So 84, 85, this is nuclear meltdown, right? Is it 1985? Yeah. Glasnost, the opening up of the Soviet Union, right? A moment, I don't know when Vonnegut was writing this, but this is a very pivotal moment, right? Where we're seeing a moment in the Cold War where there could be change, while at the same time a heightened fear of nuclear annihilation, right? This is when did the day after the film that changed so many people's consciousness about, do you remember this film, that made for TV film, is this 1984-ish?
I think so.
Right?
Yeah.
So all of this stuff is happening at the same time. This fear of nuclear annihilation and a nuclear meltdown then lead to the opening up of conversations both within the Soviet Union and across national boundaries. So does that answer your question about the Cold War a little bit? Yep. I hope I got my dates right.
It beats me. You're asking the wrong person. And again, terrifyingly accurate to like now. I mean, terrifyingly relevant to now, which is, I think, what makes the selection of this book right now so poignant for me. And I don't know if anyone else experienced this. There were multiple times throughout this book I had to just put it down because it was like looking in a mirror and going, oh, okay, that hit a little too close to home. I have to put that down. I gotta simmer on that one for a minute because that one hit too close to home. And I mean, couldn't have known these things would happen right now, but terrifying to read in the present day. So yeah, fear of nuclear annihilation, always on my mind. Quick poll, would anyone else, because I was the only person in Bloomington that was ready to become the SEAL, is anyone else with me? Or is everyone else too afraid to let go of, and it was something I had not considered until somebody else had brought it up.
I think you're leading the audience. Is everyone too afraid?
Maybe I just don't want to be alone on the beach. I just don't want to be alone on the beach. Yeah.
No seals?
No seals. That's all right. I will be alone on the beach.
No. I think anybody who thinks about that, including Vonnegut's fictional characters, would see the upside and the downside. The downside would be no more of the Pixies.
Shouts out.
The major upside would be the absence of fear, or fear as a constant like that. One of my major attractions to Vonnegut's work is that he writes about how scary it is to be a human being sometimes. He writes really eloquently and forgivingly about that. Like Cat's Cradle is a book about idiots getting a hold of something that probably shouldn't have been invented. Water that freezes at room temperature. It never crosses their mind that might go badly. And I read that book during the Great Recession. Me and my 6 roommates in Chicago didn't have jobs. I remember feeling, both terrified by that and also feeling like maybe this is a normal thing that many people have gone through. But just the constant feeling of terror was something I really had a hard time shaking. And the fantasy of the seal farting on the rock feels weirdly comforting in comparison to like the constant stream of Facebook anger that we live in today. So anyway, those are my thoughts.
I didn't notice this the first couple of times I read this, but there's this wonderful Anne Frank epigraph, right? In spite of everything, I still believe people are really good at heart, which, I mean, he's taken a piss out of Anne Frank. I mean, I can't believe that he does this in this novel, that he takes a pot shot at her. But there's an epigraph even before that I think is more interesting. He's talking about Hillis L. Howey, amateur naturalist. He's a good man who took me and my best friend, Ben Hitz, and some other boys out to the American Wild West from Indianapolis, Indiana, in the summer of 1938. And Mr. Howey's a naturalist, and he's teaching these kids about nature. And the last little section of this is, one night, Mr. Howey scared us half to death on purpose, screaming like a wildcat near our camp. And I'm thinking about the terror that you guys are feeling here, and I think that one of the things that he's doing a lot here, but one of the things he's doing is wants to terrify you. I mean, this is really horrific stuff. But the last line is interesting. One night, Mr. Howey scared us half to death on purpose, screaming like a wildcat near our camp. A real wildcat screamed back. And there's a lot of fun in that line. I think it's hilarious. I really do. But there's something like, what's on the other side of this terror? There's something even more primal, like more animalistic. Like there's a nature that is like more vindictive and vengeful than anything that this guy even imagined here. And there's something about like the vengeance of nature having the last laugh, like it's the last law here, that's even more horrifying than what humans do in a way. And that's the kind of like weird, like sublime terror that this book seems to get at. And you could either scream and crumble or you could laugh, but there isn't a lot of reaction to it in a way. And to think that he's trying to scare you in this way, but knows that there's something even scarier than it's mind-blowing to me. It's very cool. It's such a wonderful epigraph to this book, and it explains a lot.
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, actually, just kind of a follow-up. The discussion we were having here was why did pull back the curtain and show you some scary stuff, but at the same time, we were saying he's pulling for you. He's on our side. He's like, okay, our special tributes are kind of thing, but I'm on your side. We're going to there's a spark to the I mean, look, all the children.
I agree with that entirely, yeah.
Yeah, I think I'm just becoming the seal because I'm a disillusioned millennial. So I think that might be a self-report on my end. Yeah. Go for it.
I was in the Galapagos the first week in May, and it was so surreal to be so unplugged. And I had no internet, no Wi-Fi, no email, no phone, no text. Just different nature. I mean, to be on the beach with the seals and everything else, it was just.
That's great. Great to hear.
Yeah, I've heard it. I've seen pictures. I've had friends go on research trip. It looks beautiful. Is it beautiful? Confirmed? Oh my gosh. Yeah. 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 Well, according to this, you can be. You can be the National Geographic special in about 1 million years with a Swedish narrator. Maybe not the dream, but maybe this sounds like a nice gig. And so with that, we're at time. I just want to thank you all so much for your time. I want to thank our guests for their time.
Can I say one thing?
Oh my gosh, yes. Say your piece.
I don't want to drive back to Bloomington with all those T-shirts, so they're free. everyone, please grab a T-shirt in your size. Grab them for friends. And if you have any time this weekend, come down to Bloomington. Jason is speaking on Saturday afternoon. Free big concert on Kirkwood Ave with a giant Vonnegut puppet. You can't go wrong. Upland beer everywhere. So please come join us. Sorry
if you
to
have
interrupt.
absolutely not. No, plug the festival, plug the talks. I had no idea about this puppet, but now I feel like I need to go see it.
You sure do.
Again, as we wrap up, thank you so much to Upland Brewing. If you have not tried the specialty Galapagos beer, I am allergic to pineapple, so I cannot try it, but I have heard it is very good. So I highly recommend you trying their special Galapagos beer. But thank you to Upland for serving as a wonderful venue, both in Bloomington and Indianapolis. I highly recommend you visiting their Bloomington tap room. Thank you to Indiana Humanities, to Indiana Sciences, Central Indiana Science Outreach, the public libraries, and everybody who makes this possible. If you are a fan and you enjoyed yourself tonight, fear not, although we are wrapping up season 10 with Galapagos and with this lovely discussion, we will be back in August. We do not run summer sessions because everybody needs to become, if not the seal, be the person on the beach at the very least. And that is my plan for June and July. And so when I come back to the Midwest in August, if you would like to join in other book discussions, science themed, everything from engineering to economics to viruses to anything you can imagine. We've talked about a lot of things over the years. The environment, we had a great book on fungi. Didn't know you could write 500 pages about fungi and how interesting they are, but beautiful books. Come join us in August. We will be releasing a book list. You can find it at Indiana Humanities. Just Google Indiana Humanities. Follow us on, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter. I don't think they're on TikTok, but if that's your thing, you could probably find something. But keep up with us, and we would love to see you all in August. And with that, thank you so much for your time, and have a good night. Safe travels.
That's good. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. Ruskin. There's always Ruskin.
Ruskin said and did everything.
Exactly.
That ever needed to be said or done. I took an amazing course on the Frankfurt School, and like midway through the semester, the guy's like, "Let's just read like Ruskin and Pater instead," and we're like, "Yeah, this is like
Right.
This is the same thing.
Yeah.
Better. More
Exactly.
eloquent." That was great. I
Yeah.
loved it.
It's a shame people don't read Ruskin enough. I don't think.
Ruskin's amazing. Whenever
Truly.
someone mentions Ruskin, I was like, I'm gonna take like 2 years off and just read a bunch of
Wouldn't
all
that be
those
great?
guys. Who's the others? Ruskin, Pater. There's a third.
Oh, that's right. Yeah. Well, I mean, there's a number. I mean, even obviously William Morris.
Morris. Yes.
But
Yeah.
even what's his name? The good.
Oh, good.
I wanted to introduce Haley, who's our brand new staff member. As of
Welcome aboard.
We're so fun. First one ever.
It was kind of fun. It was like kind of like a chaotic. It was like, I liked it. Not in a bad way. It was just like everyone's just talking. And it was great.
Yeah.
Yes, definitely. It's awesome. I really like it a lot.
How you doing? Nice to meet you.
So what's your post at IH? What's your
Events associate.
okay,
So
cool.
a good umbrella for events.
Nice. Okay.
Yep. First whole week. Last week started whole week. Not even really. Yeah, you're right.
Started on a Wednesday, got a long weekend.
Oh, that's great. Well, I'm glad. Welcome aboard. It's great stuff.
Yeah.
I was so glad to do this because I've never been to one of these before, and it was nice to see how it worked. And it's good. It's like kind of lax. It's like nice. Like, you know, it's not like a classroom.
Yeah. Yeah. Right. No, it's really nice.
No, not at all.
So years in.
But everyone likes to lecture when they're 3 years in.
Yeah.
Exactly. Right.
Flip side.
The irony of it.
Yes.
Yeah. I used to take my graduate students to the bar, and we used to have seminars at the bar.
Yeah.
Um,
Was that productive, you think? Or?
oh, super productive. Super productive, yeah. Because we'd bring in guests, and the guests would talk. Yeah, I found it was really good.
Right, right.
Um, do they? Yeah.
Maybe we should be
Yeah.
doing this.
Oh, that's funny. Yeah.
It's wonderful to meet you all.
Same here.
We'll
Yeah.
see you again, I'm sure.
Oh yeah.
Yep, yep. So what do we need to do to clean up and fix up and...
Mainly just
Give
cleaning
out
up
shirts.
boards.
Get rid of
Shorts.
dump
Yeah.
shirts.
I think they're almost gone, really.
Yeah.
Yeah. I know, right? Okay, so you wanna
Right.
sit
Do you want to sit outside? Yeah, and chat. Take off the
I'll be in the office later this week. I'll talk to you later. How did you get this to go?